Timing is one of the most misunderstood parts of international travel, and it's also one of the most consequential. Most people don't realize how much timing actually influences the way a trip feels until they've already lived through a rushed planning experience. They usually start asking about timing at the exact moment excitement collides with pressure. They have a rough window on the calendar, they've seen photos, saved posts, maybe even heard someone else talk about their trip. And suddenly, out of nowhere, this panic shows up. Things like, did I wait too long or am I already behind, start coming to the brain. You start thinking, am I getting ahead of myself by even thinking about this now? And while that tension feels logistical on the surface, it's actually emotional. What they are sensing correctly is that international travel operates on a different timeline than domestic trips, and they don't yet know where the real pressure points actually live. Domestic travel has trained people to believe flexibility is unlimited. Flights can be booked a few weeks out, hotels can be swapped out easily, cars just appear last minute whenever you tap a button on an app, and weekend trips can be assembled quickly without much consequence. That conditioning carries over into international travel, even though the systems underneath function very differently. When people apply domestic timing expectations to international trips, they don't misjudge availability. What they actually do is misjudge effort, cost, stress, and the overall energy it takes from them. And because the consequences show up later, they tend to internalize the blame. Then they tell themselves they're bad planners or indecisive, when in reality, they were just working with the wrong framework. What is important to understand is that international trips don't just fall apart because someone planned incorrectly. They fall apart because people underestimate what actually requires lead time. Most travelers think planning equals booking flights and reserving a hotel and just boom, bam, magic, it's it. And while those are visible steps, they do get the most attention. But the real constraints in international travel live underneath that surface layer. Things like the passport validity requirements, which eliminate options before the conversation even begins. And then you have to consider items like seasonal demand, which reshapes not just the pricing, but inventory and routing. Airline schedules determine whether a journey feels smooth or exhausting long before you board a plane. And on-the-ground logistics stop being flexible once certain lodges, guides, drivers, or internal flights sell out. These components don't compress well. They are not designed to be rushed. They reward early awareness and punish last-minute urgency, even when money is available. One of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming that because something looks available online, it's actually viable. International travel systems are layered. A flight might exist, but only with punishing routing. A hotel might show rooms, but not in a category that matches your stay length or travel style. A destination might be open, but not functioning at its best due to weather, staffing, or seasonal transitions. These nuances are invisible when planning starts late because there's no time to interrogate them. Everything becomes binary. It's available or not available, book now or miss out. And that binary thinking is where stress multiplies. For the majority of international trips, a 6 to 9 month planning window is the baseline for doing things well. And that's not perfectly, but well. That window allows space to evaluate regions instead of defaulting to the most talked about one. It allows room to adjust pacing so the trip doesn't feel like a checklist. And it gives time to observe flight patterns instead of locking into the first option that appears. It creates breathing room to assess accommodations, not just for the aesthetics or price, but for location, access, and how they fit together as a sequence. Planning at this stage doesn't mean committing immediately. It means positioning yourself early enough that your eventual decisions are informed rather than reactive. This window also gives people time to understand themselves better as travelers. International trips expose energy patterns that domestic trips rarely do. Long flights, time changes, unfamiliar environments, language differences, and cultural transitions all place a different demand on your nervous system. When planning begins early, there is space to design around the reality instead of discovering it mid-trip. People who plan early tend to ask better questions. They stop asking what they should see and start asking how they want the trip to feel. That shift alone changes the quality of the entire stay. High season travel is a completely different category, and this is where timing becomes non-negotiable. For peak periods, especially winter travel, holidays, and school break windows, planning a year in advance is not aggressive. it is realistic. And the most desirable hotels and lodges sell out first, not last. In many destinations, the properties people want are intentionally small, exclusive, and limited. So waiting until 6 months out for high season usually means the conversation has already shifted. It is no longer about what fits best, and it is about instead what remains. This is also when people begin confusing price with value. When planning starts late in high season, prices are higher not because the experience improved, but because options narrowed. People end up paying more for something that fits less well simply because demand has already peaked. That creates a subtle disappointment that often gets misattributed to the destination itself, when in reality, it was the timing that removed choice long before the trip began. When planning starts late, the entire experience shifts tone. Prices rise faster, availability narrows, decisions begin to feel rushed, and people start making trade-offs they didn't expect to make. This is where travel stress sneaks in. Not because the destination isn't worth it, but because the planning process feels compressed and unforgiving. Late planning doesn't mean a trip can't happen. It means the margin for refinement is gone. Compromises arrive earlier, flexibility disappears quickly, and once those compromises stack, people often carry that tension with them into the trip itself. There is also a psychological cost to late planning that people rarely talk about. When everything is booked under pressure, there is no sense of ownership over the decisions. The trip feels like something that happened to you, not something you shaped. That lack of agency shows up as second guessing, overchecking, and anxiety before departure. Early planning, by contrast, creates confidence. And that's not certainty, but confidence. And confidence comes from understanding why choices were made. At this point, it is worth pausing for a moment. If you are listening to this and feeling a little exposed, that's not accidental. This is usually where people realize that they've been blaming themselves for something that was actually structural. They tell themselves they should have known better, should have started sooner, should have been more decisive. But timing confusion isn't a personal failure, it's a knowledge gap. Most people were never taught how international travel actually works behind the scenes. All they were taught is how to book things, but not how to design experiences. If you have ever felt the fun drain out of planning faster than expected, that's often the moment timing slipped out of alignment. This stress didn't come from the destination, it came from the compression. Once compression sets in, people stop asking expansive questions. They start asking survival questions. Items like, can we make this work? Is this good enough? Should we grab this before it disappears? And while that shift is subtle but powerful, it changes the emotional posture of the trip before it even begins. This is also where I want to be very clear. You do not need to become a travel expert to travel well. You don't need to memorize airline rules, seasonal charts, or hotel release patterns. What you need is the right information at the right moment, before urgency distorts your decisions. Timing isn't just about calendars, it's about when clarity enters the process. When people come to me early, even if they aren't ready to book, the first thing that usually shifts is relief. Not because decisions are made, but because pressure comes off. They realize that they are not late, or if they are late, they understand exactly what that means and what it doesn't. They stop spiraling. They stop reacting to every new piece of information as if it's an emergency. And that calm alone changes the quality of the choices that follow. If you are listening and thinking, I don't know yet, that the dates are fuzzy or the destination is still a maybe, that's actually the ideal moment to start. Early planning isn't about locking yourself into something rigid. It's about narrowing intelligently instead of randomly. It's about understanding what actually matters for your trip so that when it's time to commit, you are not doing it from fear of missing out or fear of getting it wrong. Once that recalibration happens, the rest of the planning process unfolds differently. People stop chasing the most talked about option and start choosing the most aligned one. They stop stacking experiences and start designing flow. They stop trying to optimize every dollar and start protecting how the trip will feel. And that's not accidental. That's what happens when timing is respected and support enters early enough to matter. From there, everything we talked about begins working in your favor. The 6 to 9 month window stops feeling theoretical and starts feeling practical. You are no longer rushing to catch up. You're watching patterns. You're comparing seasons with context. You are seeing how flights behave over time instead of grabbing the first acceptable option. You are understanding which parts of the trip benefit from early commitment and which parts benefit from patience. This is also when people begin to notice something unexpected. Planning no longer feels like a task to get through. It becomes part of the experience. There is space for anticipation without anxiety. Room to ask questions that aren't urgent but are important. Questions about pace, about recovery, about transitions, and whether the trip is being designed for who you actually are, not who you imagine you'll be once you arrive. And that distinction matters more than people realize. A lot of travel disappointment comes from designing trips for a fantasy self, someone who never gets tired, who thrives on constant stimulation, who bounces easily between environments, where early planning gives you time to design for reality instead of aspiration. And that alone prevents a huge amount of regret. Costa Rica is one of the clearest examples of why timing matters. This isn't a destination where one plan fits every traveler or every season. Regions behave differently throughout the year. Rainfall patterns affect not just weather, but road access and travel times. Wildlife activity follows predictable but nuanced rhythms that change by month and by region. Lodges often have limited room counts and strong repeat clientele, which means availability tightens earlier than people expect. Transportation requires intention because distances take time and conditions matter. Planning Costa Rica a year out for high season allows time to match the right region to the right month. It allows you to secure the lodges that actually deliver the experience people imagine. It allows you to design an itinerary that feels cohesive instead of frantic. When Costa Rica is rushed, the trip can feel overwhelming very quickly. Long drives get stacked, regions get combined without regard for geography, and expectations clash with reality. When Costa Rica is planned with time, it feels intuitive. The rhythm makes sense, the transitions land, and the experience flows instead of fighting itself. The deeper truth is that international travel rewards foresight. You don't need protection, you need room. Room to choose intentionally, to adjust when something doesn't align, to enjoy the planning process instead of pushing through it. And that room only exists when timing is respected. If you want international travel to feel calm instead of compressed, this is exactly how I support my clients, especially for destinations like Costa Rica, where timing shapes the entire experience, from the first decision to the final memory. You will find helpful links below in the caption, and if you have any questions, drop them in the comments. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.